Welcome back, everyone, to Pontus Fathom Press. This is episode 17 of the Pontus Fathom podcast, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius, Ian Fleming's James Bond. In some ways, these two seem to land next to each other, and in some ways they're very different. And kind of just juxtapose them. So it's not really versus. It's not like Jerry Cornelius is up against James Bond in this podcast. But there is somewhat of a tension there that I'd like to kind of explore some of the differences coming out of the 50s and 60s as James Bond did, and then coming out of the late 60s that Jerry Cornelius did, and how that kind of fits in that Michael Moorcock's sort of urban dandy, apocalyptic modern that Jerry Cornelius represents. So maybe we can just jump into it a little bit. As everyone knows, James Bond started out in Fleming's novels coming out of World War II. I mean, there's definitely this concept with James Bond of this, the British Empire, Queen and Country, all of these kind of post-war hope almost in the Cold War theme of the Soviets and the NATO and sort of continuing the British Empire in a way. And I think some of that trope has been continued through the movies. I mean, I just got a stack of some old James Bond DVDs here. I mean, you're starting out with Dr. No, right? You can see that there's a progression here. Dr. No, there's the later Connery and You Only Live Twice. There's Lazenby on Her Majesty's Secret Service. The Roger Moore kind of gets into the campy side of things. Timothy Dalton and up to Daniel Craig, and we have Pierce Brosnan, Daniel Craig's most recent outing. And, the spy agencies. There's something interesting about James Bond in that, like Doctor Who in a way, he seems to be regenerating. There's these fan theories out there of the different actors who play James Bond. Is there like a universe of this, or is it just, the problem with any long-running franchise, how it bumps into the changing times and reality. What's interesting, though, with right off the bat in Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius is it's kind of built into the character. There's sort of an instability with Jerry Cornelius. So I've brought out Casino Royale here, and I've got some bookmarks in here, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about the differences of Ian Fleming's Bond is definitely the quintessential spy. If we just look into a quote here giving you the character of Bond. Who is it? Asked number 2. One of the double O's, I guess, 007. He's tough, and M thinks he may be in trouble with those gunmen at Le Chiffres. Might be pretty good with cards, or you wouldn't have sat in the casino at Monte Carlo for 2 months before the war watching the Romanian team work their stuff with the invisible ink and the dark glasses. He and the Deuxième bowled them out in the end. 007 turned in 1 million francs he had won at the shimmy. Good money in those days. James Bond's interview with M had been short. "What about it, Bond?" asked M, when Bond had come back into the room after reading Head of S's memorandum, and after gazing for 10 minutes out of the waiting room window at the distant trees in the park. Bond looked across the desk into the shrewd, clear eyes. "It's very kind of you, sir. I'd like to do it, but I can't promise to win. The odds at Baccarat are at best, after 34, even odds except for the tiny Cagno. But I might not get a bad run against me and cleaned out. Play is going to be pretty high. Opening will go up to 500,000, I should think." Bond was stopped by the cold eyes. M knew all this already, knew the odds at Baccarat as well as Bond. That was his job, knowing the odds at everything, and knowing men, his own and the opposition's. Bond wished he had kept quiet about his misgivings. "Oh, he can have a bad run too," said M. "You'll have plenty of capital. Up to 25 million, the same as him. We'll start you on 10 and send you another 10 when you look around." So here's just a little flavor of the kind of exchange we've grown to know of Bond in M's office, Bond interacting with Bond, the man of cards, the man of spycraft. And maybe we'll go into one other quote here, one other section where he's talking about the casino. He's in the casino now. Bond stood in the sunshine and felt his mission to be incongruous and remote in his dark profession, an affront to his fellow actors. He shrugged away the momentary feeling of unease. Before his rendezvous at the Hermitage, he decided to take his car down to the coast road and have a quick at Le Chiffre's village, and then drive back inland road until it crossed the Route Nationale to Paris. Bond's car was his only personal hobby, one of the last of the 4.5-liter Bentleys with the supercharger by Amherst Villiers. He had bought it new in 1933 and kept it in careful storage through the war. It was still serviced every year, and in London, a former Bentley mechanic who worked in a garage near Bond's Chelsea flat tended it with jealous care. Bond drove it hard and well, and with almost a sensual pleasure. It was battleship gray convertible coupe, which really did convert, and it was capable of touring at 90 with 30 miles an hour in reserve. Bond eased out of the car up the ramp. So here we go, Bond in his cars, right? And then at the same time, we have a little flavor of Jerry Cornelius. Jerry here is having it starts out in Cambodia, the country between Vietnam and Thailand on the map. Jerry's meeting. He's in his car, and Cornelius's car radio was playing. Beneath an extravagantly bloated representation of Vishnu the Destroyer, one of Ishwar's 3 aspects, a tiny transistor radio played. It was Cornelius's radio. The tune was Zoot Suit by Zoot Money's Big Roll Band. Beside the radio, the green gold early afternoon sunshine, a man in a leisure suit came up shaking hands. Jeremiah Cornelius was a young man with long hair, fine black that flowed below his shoulders. He wore a double-breasted suit. Jerry was a European of many parts, and his Indian counterpart was a Brahmin physicist, Professor Hira. They had met in the morning. The Brahmin physicist patted the mosquitoes. The Gnostics possessed a cosmology very similar in many ways to the Hindu and the Buddhist. What figures exactly? But the figures were very close, Dr. Hira says. What figures exactly, Jerry asked politely. Oh, well, for instance, the Mahayuga. Both Hindus and Gnostics give the figure at 4,320,000 years. That's an interesting coincidence from any point of view. What about the Kalpa? I thought that was your word for the time cycle. Oh, no, that's the day and night of Brahma, 8.64 million years. As little as that, Jerry said without irony. The Mahayuga is divided into 4 yugas, or ages. The current cycle is near its end. The present age is the last of the 4. Oh, and what are they? Oh, let me think. The Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, the Tritra Yuga, and the Kali Yuga, of course, is the current age. It began on February 18th, 3102 BC. And what is the Kali Yuga? The Dark Age, Mr. Cornelius. Ha ha. And how long is that supposed to last? Just 1/10 of the Mahayuga. Oh, that gives us plenty of time. Oh, yes. So you can kind of see that there's a difference here, and there's a similarity. There's something flanneurish. There's something both extravagant about both characters. Bond, the military man, the spy, licensed to kill, but also the card player, the connoisseur of cars. Jerry also likes his cars, right? There was a small house just outside of Dover. He stopped at a filling station while he rolled himself a thin cigarette out of licorice paper in Old Holborn. Music filled the old Duesenberg as Jerry Cornelius drove towards the Kent coast. Zoot Money, The Who, The Beatles. Jerry played only the best. The volume was turned up full blast. So now you see Jerry and James having a kind of a different car experience. James rides his car hard. Jerry's kind of laid back. He's rolling up a cigarette. Behind him there's a view of the harbor. The sign moved Jerry back to Duesenberg into the hotel's courtyard, left the keys in the ignition, and got out. So Jerry's riding around a little bit more chill. He's listening to the Beatles, The Who, and Zoot Money. And he plays only the best, right? They're both men of drink. They're both kind of got a... And I think even Michael Moorcock has come out and said he never saw him as the spy. but more of like the man about town, right? He says his inspiration was William Burroughs, with whom he had begun very recent correspondence. And he also talks about J.G. Ballard. Jerry Cornelius probably is my most successful sustained attempt at an unconventional fiction. Associated with the 60s and 70s, he was equally at home in the following decades. Though novels and novellas, I developed a means of carrying several narratives and viewpoints that seemed very light. So here's the way he kind of worked in the final program, the first book, into his eternal champion. My everyman became the eternal champion, his dreams and ambitions represented by the multiverse. So in some way, and even he talks about Elric, and he talks about Doctor Who. I think Moorcock had written a Doctor Who novel as well. But there was all of these ideas of chaos theory and a number of other things coming up. And Moorcock calls out that he's not necessarily a spy. He's more like an everyman who happens to be interested in rock music. He's an English assassin. And somehow the plots are almost like a James Bond parody, except in Michael Moorcock's final program, there's some kind of world-ending event that's about to happen. So, we always have the supervillains of Bond, but in Moorcock it's a little bit different. So we see here in, they've already alluded to Kali Yuga, right, which is sort of the end of time. And then there's this sense that time is out of whack somehow in the final program. I mean, I almost have a theory that the final program reminds me of, there's this, we'll go into some examples of it, but the world is coming to an end. And Jerry is somehow, maybe there's some echoes coming backwards from time, like a Tenant thing, right? Where as the world has already ended in the near future, the catastrophe of that has back propagated into the, reverse time, into Jerry Cornelius' age, where he sort of has the ripples of that effect are impacting him. Or maybe the world's already come to an end, and Jerry Cornelius is just sort of living in the wake of the lost world, right? And there's a number of things that show this destabilized nature of time-space kind of in the book. One of which is Jerry is in the library of his father's home, I believe, which is booby-trapped with LSD of all things, right? And so we have, so he goes to the library. Jerry winced and looked at the books. One of the titles was Time Search Through the Declining West by Jeremiah Cornelius, M-A-H-S. Another was called Toward the Ultimate Paradox, and beside it was The Ethical Simulation. Jerry felt he was right to be embarrassed. So here we have call-outs to maybe the world as ethical simulation, the decline of Western civilization, the ultimate paradox, which could allude to the multiverse, things like this, right? And again, you've got this hip rock thing that's going on. So while in the story, Jerry's encountering what starts out to be kind of like a Bond-esque female, Mrs. Brunner. And we have in the James Bond, obviously we have Vesper is his the Bond girl, sort of, right? So he meets up with her and he says, her dress was black velvet, simple and yet the touch of splendor only a half dozen courtiers of the world could achieve. There was a thin necklace of diamonds at her throat. She carried a plain back evening bag. You look superb, lovely. She put her arm through his. Do you mind if we go straight to dinner, she asked. He goes, I can drink to the health of the new frock I can't drink to the health of your new frock without knowing your Christian name. Vesper, she said, Vesper Lynn. And then Cornelius obviously has his sister Catherine, who's also his lover, right? And like other Moorcock heroes, he's doomed to kill her. And there's some kind of odd, almost disturbing in the sense of time is unstable in a way, with Frank, Cornelius, his sister Catherine, this love of, his true love, who's his sister, and she dies, and so on. Yeah. So here he is driving the car again, and while James Bond is off in Casino Royale, preparing to play Le Chiffre, Jerry is driving around the Duesenberg, listening to John, Paul, George, and Ringo serenading with the old standards, Baby in Black. Oh dear, what can I do? Baby's in black and I'm feeling blue. They were still his favorites. She thinks of him, and so she dresses in black, and though he'll never come back, she's dressed in black. Halfway to Blackheath, he stopped off at the newsagent's and brought himself 2 Mars bars, 2 cups of strong black coffee, 2 pounds of newsprint labeled news section, business section, leisure section, arts section, pop section, car section, comic supplement, color supplement, novel supplement, and holiday advertising supplement. So he buys the newspaper, he buys some candy bars, and he listens to the Beatles, right? So he's definitely not James Bond, but very interesting, right? So next off, we've got Miss Brunner, who also ends up being like the Bond villain by the end of Jerry Cornelius' story. And there's an oddness that goes throughout the whole book. What had Cornelius been getting at? Time disintegrating? She'd never read one of his books, but she'd heard of them. Did some of them talk about cyclical time, like Donne? The ultimate point in the future? And what if something interrupted the cycle? The historical event, perhaps, of such importance that the whole pattern was changed. The nature of time, assuming that it was cyclical, would be disrupted. If she could get her computer built and start her other project at well, she might be the person who could save something from the wreckage. She could consolidate everything left into one big program, the final program, she thought. Idea and reality brought together, unified. She would need more power and more money, but with a bit of luck and intelligent exploitation of a shaky world situation, she could get both. So here we have the birth of Miss Brunner as like a Bond villain, and where we have Le Chiffre is... we have Le Chiffre as, about to be set up in this card game for Bond to exploit. Obviously, things don't work out in Bond's interest, and Bond ends up being captured and tortured. Bond closed his eyes. He paused and his wrists lifted slightly to his knees. Bond's flesh cringed as the cane surface just touched him. This is where he's being tortured. Bond closed his eyes and waited for the pain. He knew that the beginning of torture is the worst. There was a parabola of agony, a crescendo leading up to a peak, and then nerves are blunted. All he could do was pay for the peak, pray that his spirit would hold out long enough until the final blackout. He had been told by colleagues who survived torture by the Germans and the Japanese that toward the end there came a wonderful period of warmth and languor. So Le Chiffre tortures him, and then finally Le Chiffre's taken out, and Bond goes back to recover. And in a weird way, it's you have this transcendent Jerry Cornelius, who sort of surviving a different kind of experience, right? So they're talking about a time fix. Tempodex is my remedy for everyone. It'll turn on lovely sport. You can feel those millions of years just wasting in your spine, moving up into your back brain, into your forebrain. All them brains, Jerry, with the Tempodex starts opening them up. He's in a jolly mood, said Miss Brunner from somewhere behind the wall. Can we throw something at him? Isn't there more gas? They said, this is talking to Frank. So they've got this plan to come up with the future. And where the Bond villain is quite... now, obviously, we have some elaborate Bond villains. You have Bond villains in the movies of inside of a underwater lair, inside of a volcano. There's, in the hotel with hydrogen bombs inside of it. In this case, the villainry is something beyond just the villain. There's this passage where we're starting to get to the reveal of what Miss Brunner is on about in her sort of Bond villain form, right? And so here she says, aimlessly, Jerry. Before we get to that, both Jerry and James kind of have a falling out with the loved one. I mean, Vesper has her confession to James, where she sends him the letter. And my darling James, the letter opened. He throws it down on the bed as if it had been a scorpion. I love you with all my heart, and while I read these words, I hope you still love me now, because these words, this is the last moment that your love will last. So goodbye, my sweet love, while we still love each other. I am an agent of the MWD. Yes, I'm a double agent for the Russians. I was taken in a year after the war, and I've worked with them ever since. He was trained by M and dropped back into Poland. They suspected Le Chiffre, but they didn't know that your assignment was, and I told them something to do with you. That was what I told them. I was told not to stand behind you in the casino and to see that neither Mathis Leitner did. That is why the gunman nearly shot you. And then I had to stage that kidnapping. You may have wondered why I was so quiet in the nightclub. They didn't hurt me because I'm working for MWD. But they were afraid I would talk, I suppose, and I got final word that Smersh would come for me if I didn't obey them, so I took notice. I was in love with you. It's late now and I'm tired. My only excuse is that I love you and you're the man I tried to save, but I've got to be brave. You might save my life, but I couldn't bear the look in your eyes, my love, and that's Vesper. So he throws it down, and then the book ends with, he realizes that she's just a spy, and it kind of ends up with, she's working for the Russian machine, and then they kind of end with the line is, this is 007 speaking, this is an open line. Yes, it's emergency, can you hear me? Pass this one on. 3030 was a double, working for Redland. Yes, damn it, I said was. The bitch is now dead. So in the book version, Bond treats her as a spy and ends her as a spy. Just like, I guess in some ways, Jerry unceremoniously is unable to save or actually ends up killing Catherine. But then as things transform, we get a look into this asymmetrical kind of view of the end of the world that's happening, right? So this is sort of an end of the world side of Jerry Cornelius that's a little bit different than the James Bond world. So we have here, for Jerry's house symbolized the very spirit of transience, and he enjoyed the feeling he got looking from it. Like he liked listening to last year's hits. The house stood on the edge of a cliff. The searchlight was trained on the house, making it rather like some grotesque war memorial. Jerry knew that the house was staffed by a small private army of German mercenaries, men who were as much a part of the past as the house, and yet intertemporally reflected something of the spirit of the 1970s. It was 1960-something, however, as Jerry cut the engine. So there's something very odd about this sentence. Like, so wait, they're kind of futuristic. There's something from the future. What's going on with this future? And then he has this other strange one. Aimlessly, he wandered among the pin tables and fruit machines, bent over by happy young men who worked excitingly hand in hand. Jerry sighed and thought of the true aristocracy who would rule the 70s were out in force, the queers and the lesbians and the bisexuals, already aware that their great destiny would be realized when the central ambivalence of sex would be totally recognized and the terms male and female would become meaningless. This is odd. This is written in 1968, right? So you've got to say that there's nothing new under the sun, because these are kind of current topics, right? Here they were as he wandered. He was surrounded by the possible replacements for sex. One or several became the main driving force for humanity of circa 2000. So it says Jerry Cornelius in the 1960s in London is thinking on the death of Catherine, and somehow the year 2000 and the modality of, future post-gender or super-gender LGBTQ kind of things are on his mind, right? Which I think in the 60s were probably starting to emerge, right? But then it sort of goes into this, the birth rate, which had continued at the speed predicted of the early 60s, would have produced by year 4000 a planet consisting of core, crust, and nothing but human beings. Europe, as usual, was ahead of the world. Most of those in Europe who haven't been able to stand the pace had emigrated off to America, Africa, Russia, and Australia, and elsewhere, where they could wallow in the nostalgia produced by American fashions and television shows and mass opinion. The flow had been two-way, and the passengers for 1950 going one way, and the passengers for 2000 coming the other way. So what is this about? Like passengers from the past and passengers from the future? Only France, Switzerland, Sweden, temporal and temporary bastions, hung back and stood soon to be shaken to pieces by the imminent pre-entropic wash of crisis. This would not change the mood, Jerry thought, but a change of mind. So there's something amiss that's like a quantum event, like some kind of singularity that's going on in Jerry Cornelius. You can see the stakes are much higher than in a Bond book, right? And it's totally bonkers, right? Bond is grounded in spycraft, the Cold War. To sort of double down on this, let's talk about the different agencies. Now we're familiar with Spectre. I mean, we have the James Bond Spectre film and the old Spectre from the various books. But in Casino Royale, we actually have a different organization that's called out. And they've got a dossier of this. And I think I'll contrast this with so Appendix B, this is sort of James's dossier, and they're talking about SMERSH. Appendix B, subject SMERSH, sources, own archives and scanty material made available by Deuxième Bureau and CIA Washington. SMERSH is a conjunction of two Russian words, smert spionam, meaning roughly death to spies. Ranks above MWD, formerly NKVD, and is believed to come under the personal direction of Beria. Headquarters Leningrad, substation Moscow. Its task is the elimination of all forms of treachery and backsliding within the various Soviet secret services and secret police at home and abroad. It is the most powerful and feared organization in the USSR and popularly believed never to have failed a mission of vengeance. It is thought that SMERSH was responsible for the assassination of Trotsky in Mexico, 22 August 1940, and may have indeed made its name after the successive murder attempts of other Russian individuals had failed. SMERSH was next heard of when Hitler attacked Russia, and then rapidly expanded to cope with the treachery and double agents during the retreat from the Soviet forces in 1941. At that time it worked. So this is sort of like pre-KGB, SMERSH. It's sort of like the secret funders of some of these things. So you get this kind of view of, and this is kind of like the Spectre concept too. You know, you've got other spy agencies. You've got MI6. You've got CIA. You've got SMERSH. You end up with Spectre, which is the criminal organization. But nothing like that can prepare us for Miss Brenner's Duel. Come, take a look at Duel, the pride of Laplab. Duel was huge. Its great angular, nearly featureless bulk stretched up for nearly 200 feet. It was growing around three walls of the far cavern in a green semicircle covering at least a third of a mile. At its base, teams of technicians sat like a pool of office girls typing out data and feeding it in. Nothing's coming out, I see, Jerry leaning back. She goes, oh no, not for a while. There's another cavern for you to know. One you didn't even find in your first trip. They keep a constant pressure inside that shuts out the smell and the noises. As they went through on the other side of the airlock, it was carved about 200 feet wide and 500 feet in diameter. It was lighted with yellow simulated sunshine, and part of it was cultivated into a flower garden. A touch of vulgarity in my personality, she said. Do you recognize it? I think so. It's Hearst's Palace in San Simeon. So he goes, you don't like caves yourself, though. You didn't want to go on, as I remember. You're right. It isn't a womb for me, Mr. Cornelius. It's a womb for Duel and what it will create. What will it create? The ultimate joke. Fine words he followed. Do you know what's behind? Do you know what you'll find behind the blank walls of that computer? Jerry paused and turned, leaning on the banister. Not a giant abacus. You told me at the party. Living human brains that can function for hundreds of years if I need them that long. That's the sort of sophistication going into Duel. That's your ultimate joke? No, it's just part of the food routine. You're getting earnest, Miss Brunner. You're right. Come on. So anyway, you get some insights into Duel. And Duel's purpose was twofold. The first job was to feed it the sum total of human knowledge in one comprehensive integral equation. This was at last achieved 3 days ago, and I congratulate you. In the second part that mystified most of you, the technical problem of how to feed this program directly into a human brain was overcome with the help of notes donated by Dr. Leslie Baxter, the psychobiologist. And what sort of brain could attempt such a fantastic program? The question is answered, and I answer the question you have all been asking. Duel's ultimate use to us is to satisfy an aim. The ultimate aim of all human endeavor since Homo sapiens first evolved. It's a simple aim we're near achieving. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to produce an all-purpose human being. A human being equipped with total knowledge. Hermaphrodite in every respect. Self-fertilizing and self-regenerating, and thus immortal, recreating itself over and over again, retaining its knowledge and adding to it. In short, ladies and gentlemen, we are creating a being that our ancestors would have called a god. Then Jerry sort of floats up. He felt himself merging with Miss Brunner. And he felt tiny pricks of pain in his skull as his memories and Miss Brunner's, his identity and hers, merged for a moment and then slowly dispersed until his mind was blanked out and Duel began to do its stuff. Okay, so Duel is beginning to do its stuff. So talk about a freaky, not James Bond, where James Bond is just sort of in the world of spycraft. And even though we do see with the movies, as I called out, we've got the different Bond actors that kind of give us the sense of the everyman of Jerry Cornelius, right? His face has changed over time, right? He's been many people. But that's not in the original books, and I think that kind of everyman thing just comes more out of the pop culture side of James Bond, where Moorcock really wanted to embrace this right off the bat. So let's jump into just another quick one. So I had read somewhere that Jerry Cornelius is kind of paraphrasing some of his work in Elric, and I just wanted to call out this one. So just like in Elric, Cimmeril is his cousin. He's in love with her. She dies in his hands. He's warring with his other cousin, just like Jerry's warring with Frank. But I found that this reference to sort of like the eternal Jerry Cornelius. Coram saw the newcomer now. He was calling to Elric in the albino strain to catch his words. "Jari," he shouted. "The one you came to save," Elric asked. "Aye." Elric made a press forward into the room. "But Jerry O'Connell. Jerry Cornelius, maybe, right? Waved him back. No, stay there." Elric frowned. Another JC, right? He was about to ask when he was attacked on two sides by these tiger creatures. And then... "Hurry," cried Jerry O'Connell. "This is your only chance." Elric looked at Coram. "He knows many things." So Arakosa linked his brawny arms with Coram, and Elric did the same on the other side. Arakosa drew his sword. And then Jerry O'Connell was following him and joined Elric at the window. "How do you know what to do?" Elric said. "I know because I know you, Elric of Melniboné, just as I know Arakosa there, for I travel in many ages, on many planes. It is why I am sometimes called companion to champions. But the tower will be destroyed, and will be too weak to destroy it. Aye, possibly. Come forward, Jerry. Grab my hat." Jerry O'Connell returned to the larger room. He lit a brand and removed it from the fireplace. Elric stared suspiciously at Jerry O'Connell. "How can you know all this?" "I have told you I have lived many lives as friends to heroes. Unwrap this burden and you will return to Tanalorn. Use the arrows of quartz like spears." So you can see that there is some of this eternal champion cross-time even in his other workings, Moorcock's played with this Jerry Cornelius. And as you can see in the later books, I think that in the later editions of, I think it's in the Muzak, The Condition of Muzak, the fourth book of the Cornelius Quartet, Jerry Cornelius is actually like a teenager. And like he's different cases. Then there's this quote from Time Out here on the cover. It says, Jerry is the perfect modern hero because he's about the effect that speed in every conceivable sense has on our consciousness. So I thought I'd kind of leave it with that. And, you know, if we go to the final transformation of Jerry and Miss Brunner, the technicians looked at his watch. The chamber had been rolled on canisters close to dual. The great semicircles of computers were joined, and the scientists and technicians made a circle. A tall, naked, graceful being stepped out. It had Miss Brunner's hair and Mr. Cornelius's eyes. Miss Brunner's predatory jaw was softened by Jerry's aesthetic mouth. It was hermaphrodite and beautiful. "Hi, fans," said Cornelius Brunner. The cavern reverberated with massive shouts of exultations. Cornelius Brunner, Cornelius Brunner. Cornelius Brunner was making a scene. "You can call me Corn," it grinned, and blew kisses to them all. Corn cocked an ear. "The enemy is at our gates. Forward," pointing to the outer cavern. And rolling on a tide of its jubilant sycophants, many thousand strong, Cornelius Brunner sat on the shoulders as they flooded forward. The flow changed. Cornelius Brunner pointed to the southwest. That way, to Finland first. It streamed over the borders. It streamed down the length of Finland, flocked toward Germany. The thousands became millions as the new Messiah was born across the continent. The vast swarm reached Belgium. Its exuberant voice could be heard in thousands of miles. "This is the life," yawned Cornelius Brunner, whose skull contained the sum of human knowledge. "I think this might well kip down here as anywhere." Cornelius Brunner fell asleep. Night fell and the morning followed and awoke. Where to now? To Normandy and to the house of Cornelius. And finally we end with this sort of deified hermaphrodite Cornelius Brunner merged being, which is so bizarre. Like nothing like this would ever happen in James Bond, right? Just people die and he's still a spy, and it's really grounded in the world. Just to wrap up, I wanted to call out that speed, the effect of speed, Paul Virilio's Negative Horizon here. Just a quick one. The invention of the vehicle as animal, man arrives at one of the first forms of relativity. And he says in this book, in some ways, man's always the passenger, but our first vehicle was woman, right? Men are born within a woman, right? So the Virilio talks about the metempsychosis of the passenger. Man is the passenger of woman, not only at the time of birth, but actually during their intimate relations. Hence the taboo, the vicious cycle of the voyage. Paraphrasing Samuel Butler, we could say that the female is the means that male found to reproduce himself, to come into the world. So in some ways we have the idea of animals reproducing as kind of vehicular, like, we carry inside of ourselves the next generation. And then he talks about the great vehicle and this idea of acceleration. Movement power becomes thus a phenomenon of generalized dissection in which nothing can any longer remain as it is. It is not only in the procession that is the truth, for the staging of the distancing becomes, in the dromoscopic decomposition of vision, a kind of sacrifice. With endoscopy, for example, the trip becomes the introspection of the organs, right? With an endoscope, you journey into the body and look through the organs, right? You penetrate to the center of living matter, moving across a field of gaze that's no longer limited to exterior territories. And the profusion of the intimate dimensions of one being, where clinical observation breaks in a kind of flaying, where the organs without a body appear bit by bit like obscure zones of life. Right? So in the similar way, like the great distances. Since the transportation revolution, the remote has become so close that the resistance and the opacity of matter seems to take on the attraction of a new exoticism. The distancing is no longer so much the result of the temporal duration and the spatial extension of the course as that of the durability and solidity of the material. A new vertigo, the solidity of the world under our feet, attracts us like the plane once attracted the nomad and the rider. Secretly we will desire, it seems, this fall of the body into solids. The totalitarian ideology of transparency catches up here, and the transport demands it be brought up to date. Even faster, even higher, but also even deeper, the pathways of subterranean transparency. Now here's what's interesting. We're talking about subterranean transparency, right? In Duel, in Jerry Cornelius, it's an underground cave. And there's even some Hollow Earth things going on in Jerry Cornelius' world. But this is a metaphor of the unconscious, maybe, or of the journey within. And Virilio's sort of talking about this. The planetary depths will thus appear like the last horizon to be settled, but a settling of the shadows that will finally prove to only be an aftershock, not an effect, of the underside of the conquest of space, the retreat, the recoil of space into the center of matter. Just as the actor and the orator fashion their acting style with the use of audiovisual technology, various rules of the game are subjected in their turn to the impact of broadcast technology. So they're talking about broadcasting of Olympic Games, the watching of races, the idea of the novel as a voyage within, right? So these voyages within become very interesting, and you can see how, oddly enough, Moorcock's vision of the reinventing end-of-time hero, the eternal champion hero, in a way gets echoed by the pop machine, like the pop machine that churns out all these different actors of James Bond, right? We have all these kind of period pieces of James Bond, and he changes with the time, yet he keeps the same name, right? And I think with Moorcock, he just started with this idea. I mean, this is something that he had just latched onto early on. So yeah, I think I'll leave it with that. I just wanted to share some of these differences between Jerry Cornelius. I am going to be making my way through these works of Cornelius. I've not yet read the Cornelius calendar or Jerry Cornelius' Lives and Times, so I'll be working through those. And looking forward to your feedback and comments. Let me know what you guys think. Have you read Jerry Cornelius? Do you have your own thoughts on it? What do you think about his relation with Ian Fleming's James Bond, the James Bond films, Paul Virilio, Negative Horizons? I mean, one last anecdote is Virilio's got this great little quote where he talks about, and in the tradition of James Bond in his Aston Martin, or Jerry Cornelius in his Duesenberg, you've got Virilio talking about the racetrack, right? And you have all these speed records get broken, right? But they're going in a circle. Like the racetrack is going in a circle, going in a circle, going in a circle. And he says if you put the camera, horizontal to the cars racing by, if they go fast enough and fast enough and fast enough, like, fast, it gets to the point where, like, you almost don't see anything. So in a weird way, like, making the speed limit is approaching disappearing, right? And I think that this is interesting because with Jerry Cornelius, we have that idea of, has the end of time already happened? Are we in the wake of the end of time, or are we feeling the wake of the end of time that's still off in the future, rippling back at us? And I think this is very similar to the decay of the British Empire and or to the decline of the British Empire at the end of the war, and how Bond sort of stood as, a champion for preserving sort of a certain way of life, right? And I think there's a kind of a cool nature to Bond, where it makes it not only just the negative. There's probably lots of negative sides that we could go into, but I think that there's the positive side is, just like in Jerry Cornelius, Bond's traveling the world, right? We get to see all these different kind of places. We see this traveling. Virilio talks about this idea of travel as, once it was just riding a horse and it took you weeks. And then we got to this time of planes where we can be places. Now we can go on the internet and kind of see a place with remote vision, right? And this is this weird confusion of travel, gaze, time, all kind of come into play. And I think that in a fun, playful way, you can find an interesting correlation in both of these works about where we stand in that kind of epic modernizing, times of modernizing, right? Different slices of the modernizing, It's almost like the Aeschylean period and the Sophoclean period, you can almost say. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening. Comments below. Check out our links and talk to you soon. Thanks, bye.